Okay, folks, it's 10 a.m. We're going to go ahead and get started. Uh, this is the league's mini series. This one will be about property taxes. It's actually a very basic class on property taxes. Unlike sales tax, I do not profess to be an expert in this area, although I do know enough, apparently, to be dangerous. So I will give everybody a chance to get their Post-it and put it up in this corner so you don't have to look at me, and then we can get going from there. There is a chat feature available. Let's not use that though, because that can get a little chaotic as time goes by. But I will be pausing here and there. If you see that little Q&A piece on there, go ahead and click on that, type in a question for me, and if there's any questions, I will stop and handle those as we go along. So with that, we're up to lucky 13, so let's go ahead and get started. Property taxes in Arizona. And this is the part where Tom usually screams and yells that the thing's not working, so let's just... By the way, Tom's not here today. That's how I wound up in this. There we go. Now we got it working. Tom is not here because apparently his son is getting married tomorrow, so what are you going to do? All right, so property tax in Arizona, we're basically going to cover a handful of things, some of the histories and basics of how we got to where we are with the system that we have today. We're going to talk about what the primary property tax is, what the secondary property tax is used for. We're going to go over all of the classes for the property tax classification system. And then we're going to talk about how do you go about calculating a levy using an example home. One of the important things to keep in mind, there are two different things that we're going to be looking at. One will be your rate, which is the rate that your mayor and council set each year. And the other half of that is the levy. And the levy is the piece that is actually limited by statute. So that's an important distinction. It's not your rate that's limited, it's your levy that is limited. So with that, let's get right into it. So before 2012, we had the primary property tax, which was limited property value with a net assessed value. And there was a secondary property tax, which was based on full cash value and developed its own net assessed value. So the property tax side, the primary side, I should say, would be the piece that runs your local government, pays for your local government. Limited cash or limited property value is always less than full cash value. We'll get into that a little bit more when we get into those sections. In 2012, Prop 117 was passed, which essentially took full cash value out of the calculation. It's still calculated, but because it is used for other things, but it no longer affects primary or secondary property tax levies. Now, LPV, the limited property value, can only go up by 5% per year. Anything greater than that, and it becomes capped. So that's why you'll see limited property value will lag behind full cash value as you go through time. And that was put in largely in response to the run-up in property values right before the recession, when there was the run-down of property values. So, but there is a limitation on the ability for a property value to rise by no more than 5% per year. And there were other items included in Prop 117 that had to deal with fines and fees and a variety of other things. So let's talk about full cash value, because that's where the whole process starts. Full cash value, theoretically, should reflect the market value of all the real property that you have in your city or town. Arizona courts have interpreted that full cash value should mean cash equivalent value. The reality is, although it's synonymous with market value, the value established by the assessor is always less than actual market value. When you talk to the assessors on residential property in particular, what they're shooting for is roughly about 80% of market value. That's sort of the full cash value that they come up with. It's an assessor thing, believe me. I've been to these these conventions of theirs and their conferences, and they explain why they do that, and I don't get it. So let's just say that full cash value is roughly about 80% of actual market. At least that's their goal. So once you have the full cash value, then the next piece is the limited property value. LPV is limited by the Constitution to grow by no more than 5% each year, and it can never exceed full cash value. Okay, very unlikely that that would ever happen because, like I said, full cash value is supposed to represent about 80% of market, and limited is sort of stuck where it is and can't go up by more than 5, no matter what the market is doing. So the assessor each year in each county goes out and establishes the full cash value and the limited value, but only LPV is the thing that we're only going to be using for calculating your levy, for calculating what property taxes are actually going to be paid by any particular property owner. So let me just pause here after full cash value and limited property. Do we have any questions right now? I'm not seeing anything popping up, so I will just roll on. Very good. So from all of that, you get your net assessed value. The way net assessed value is calculated, you multiply a specific assessment for each of one of the 9 classes by the limited property value, the LPV. So the NAV is your tax base for both primary and secondary tax now. It's calculated only using LPV, so full cash value doesn't really have any value at all in determining property tax. It's all about limited property value. Limited property value times the assessment ratio for the class gives you your NAV. Add up all of the NAVs, that's your levy. So let's talk about primary property taxes. Primary property tax is what you use to fund your operations for the government. This is the basic. This is the piece that you can use to do whatever you want with. This is the money that goes to your general fund. The Constitution, state Constitution, limits any increase in primary property tax levy to 2% each year, plus whatever new construction has come in since the last year. So each year you're going to get a report from the assessor that says that all of your properties are total this amount in value and total this amount in NAV. And that NAV times the appropriate levy for, the appropriate ratio for each class gives you the total of your availability to levy. That's the most you can put out there. And that can go up by 2% each year. Okay. There's also a piece in there where they identify what new construction is. So if last year you had, and let's make it easy, last year you had $1 million in levy available. There was new construction of 100,000. So now your new value is going to be 1.1 million and plus 2%. Okay. Now the base year levy was established in 7980. I'm sure that at least some of you are doing overrides or home rule where you can get around that particular number by using the number that has grown over time, that grew more rapidly than the base levy from fiscal year 79 to 80. It was recalculated in 2006, but frankly, it's still relatively low compared to what most of you have for home rule. The levy limit increases each year. The idea is that if you don't bother to raise your rate, your levy limit is going to increase, so you can actually have some capacity to continue to grow your budget if necessary, as necessary. So that's the first piece. Now, once again, in terms of how much an owner-occupied residence can pay, Constitution again says that primary property tax may not exceed 1% of the LPV on owner-occupied residences. So what that means is all of the taxing jurisdictions combined cannot total more than 1% of the LPV. the amount that's levied on each individual homeowner cannot exceed that 1%. Okay? So if the tax exceeds that amount, so more than $10 per 100%, $100 of assessed value, then the school district primary taxes get reduced. That's what happens. Until 2014, the state provided aid directly to the school district to make up that difference between the rate and the cap. That piece has been removed. And so now, when you look at primary property taxes, school districts are the largest component of that. So that has that's been removed to try to bring some of those school districts back down, I suppose. Whether that works or not is another question. And thankfully, nobody is popping up with a question about DSEG funding, so we'll keep moving. So finishing up, beginning in 15, state law limited the state aid payments to $1 million per county. So they still do contribute to the property tax that gets paid to the various jurisdictions, but it's now limited to $1 million total per county. So all the jurisdictions have to share in that, and if there's anything that's left over, then that still needs to be paid, then that must be transferred by jurisdictions within the school district that is out there. So it gets a little complicated when you get out near the edge of the primary property tax levy. And seeing no questions still, let's talk about secondary. Secondary property taxes. This is for all of your voter-approved bonds and your budget overrides, and also all the special districts. These are all things that require an election in order to be put in place. Once put in place, then there are other limitations on secondary property taxes. Generally, you're only allowed to maintain. You have to set your rate in such a way that you can only pay the principal and interest without building up too much of a reserve fund. That's becoming more and more limited as time goes on, because we're seeing proponents of that limitation were saying that that cities were stockpiling too much money in their reserves. Frankly, that just seemed to be good financial sense, but they changed the rules, so that is now no longer allowed. You can only retain so much in reserve to pay for either to pay down the bond or to hold money for people who fail to pay their tax. So for GO bonds, there is no limitation, unlike property taxes where they have all of those. There are all those rules on how high your levy can be, because a general obligation bond just says that you're going to you're obligated based on your revenues, and it's up to the voters. So there are no limits. We assume that the voters will limit it. For budget overrides, there are a variety of limitations on budget overrides. Essentially, it's the home rule issue where every 4 years you have to renew that. You have to go back to the voters and ask them to approve to continue overriding your budget. And then with special districts, each one sort of has its own set of rules roughly as to how it goes about being done, because each of those special districts was put into statute by a legislature that was looking at one issue one day. So they set up their own variety of mechanisms for how that would be done. Now, did anybody have any questions about primary or secondary tax before we move on? I'm still seeing nothing, so I am still happy. Okay. There are several property tax exemptions out there, and each year we see a variety of new items that are introduced into the legislature. Right now we have disabled persons, widows, widowers. They're typically trying to put in veterans with PTSD or first responders or a variety of other folks each year that come along. people over 65 getting frozen at whatever level they might be, that sort of thing. Typically, all of these exemptions come with specific requirements related to the age of the person who's the homeowner, whether or not they're on SSI, or if they have a household income, certain levels of relative to the poverty level, the national poverty level. Now, the important thing to recognize, as with all property tax issues, and we'll see this again when we get into classifications, exemptions do not affect your total levy. Your total levy is whatever your total levy is going to be. Again, that's property value times NAV is going to get you your total levy. So what happens is your maximum total levy is determined by that formula that we discussed earlier, from going back from 7980. It grows each year. And that number will continue to grow regardless of what the actual NAV is, regardless of what the exemptions are out there, because it's like a balloon. Just because this group of taxpayers have received an exemption and won't be paying, or have received this lower assessment ratio, the levy number remains the same, which means that tax burden just gets shifted over to everybody who doesn't have the exemption or who is in a higher assessment ratio. So effectively, the number is the same. It's just a matter of who is going to pay it that moves back and forth, depending on what the rules are and what their particular type of property is. Do we have any questions on that area? Excellent. Missed. There we go. Maybe. There it is. Okay. So let's talk about the classifications now. So there are 9 separate classifications, 9 separate categories. Each one of them covers a specific type of property or a group of properties. They try to keep them together. And each one of those classifications has its own assessment ratio. And those ratios range from 1% for certain renovation things up to 18.5% for business. So you'll frequently hear people from ATRA complaining that the business tax rate is way too high because it used to be 25, now it's down to 18.5. But that's not fair because homeowners only pay 10. So, but whatever, that's a philosophical argument. Assessment ratios are applied to limited value. Again, full cash value doesn't really mean much of anything in the property tax world. So when you apply that ratio of whatever percentage it is to the limited property value, that will determine your net assessed value. You're going to multiply your net assessed value times the rate, and that's how much tax you're going to collect. So, class 1. This is the typical commercial business class. Includes mines, telecom, gas companies, water companies, pipelines, all the commercial and all commercial personal property that exceeds that full cash value. Very easy to recognize and remember. 3. So anything that has a full cash value in terms of property or equipment at a commercial or industrial operation is also going to be subjected to Class 1 property tax, which is assessed at 18.5% of the limited property value. Now, that's found in ARS 42-12001. Class 1 is 12001. Class 2, 12002. Class 3, 12003. Hopefully you're noticing a pattern. So if you're looking for the actual statute, that's where you're going to look. 42-12001 is the starting point, and then it just rolls on from there. So Class 2 is agricultural land and vacant land. It also includes golf courses. And again, we've got agricultural personal property exceeding the very simple, easy to remember 146,973. That is the Class 2 property is assessed at a 16% rate. So the limited property value times 16% times your tax rate gets you your levy. Class 3 property, 10%. This is for owner-occupied. Owner-occupied means it's the primary residential residence of the owner or a relative of the owner as defined in statute. parents, grandparents, sons, daughters, stepsons, adopted sons, et cetera, et cetera, and adopted daughters and adopted stepdaughters, all those people. It's all listed in the statute. It does not extend potentially out as far as you might think, but as long as it's the principal residence of either the owner or an owner's immediate family member, you're going to check the box for Class 3. There's an important reason why you would rather be in Class 3 than Class 4, and we'll get to that in just a sec. Class 4 is all of your residential rental property. So this includes houses and that are held for residential rental, that are not occupied by the owner or family member, and also all apartments, also all properties held in foreclosure by a bank. So that was a big problem area a few years back. At this point, most of the foreclosures, most of the bulk of the sudden foreclosures by everybody are pretty much over, and now we're down just to regular old folks going broke and being foreclosed on. But banks all have Class 4 property as well. So why the difference? The difference between Class 3 and Class 4, Class 3 is eligible for state aid. So there is a certain amount of property, of your property tax, where you will see, if you look at your property tax bill, that you're receiving state aid in an amount of a few $100s probably. That only applies to owner occupied. What that does is exactly what it says. The state general fund pitches in and helps pay a portion of your property tax. It is not available to Class 4, which is why it is so important to make certain that all of your residential rental properties and all of your apartment complexes, et cetera, are on Class 4, because they are not allowed to have that state aid, thereby reducing the obligation of the state, reducing the obligation for all of us. So rolling on, Class 5, 15% is the assessment ratio. This is for rail and airline property. It's not a very big class, but it's there. Class 6. Class 6 is the one that every year somebody new is attempting to get themselves shifted into. Class 6 started out as being foreign trade zones and enterprise zones, and then it started getting bigger and bigger and bigger, and now we've got qualifying military reuse stuff is in there, and the non-commercial historic property. And the reason everybody wants to try to move all the business community wants to try to move into Class 6 if they can get there, is because of the 5% assessment ratio, figure. That's much better than the 18.5 that they are typically moving out of. So this is why it's important when somebody like Intel comes along and wants to be in a foreign trade zone or an enterprise zone. This is what they're going for. This is what it is that they're looking for. So it's a very desirable class. Class 7 is for historical property, commercial and industrial historical property, I should say. Now, the difference between this, commercial property, again, it's still historic, and it's still taxed at 18.5%. The difference between Class 7 and Class 1 is that when you're in the process of renovating one of these historical properties, that's a commercial property, your assessment is set at 1% instead of 18.5. Class 8, same deal. This is residential rental historic property. Owner occupied is still going to be owner occupied. Residential rental, though, does also have the option for that renovation period, where you can be renovating the property and only have the 1% ratio. So, and then there's Class 9. Okay, Class 9 is, well, it's possessory interest, which is not terribly common or terribly important. What it really falls for here is for nonprofit that nonprofits that operate charter schools or churches, religious assembly, et cetera, et cetera. This is your church classification. And we also wound up with nonprofit charter schools in this classification as well. And again, the importance of Class 9 is that it is assessed at 1%. Let's check for questions. I like you people. You're not asking questions. That's good. Moving on. Okay, so let's calculate a tax bill. Okay, so we're going to look at a piece of property that's Class 3. This is how you're going. This is a piece of how your individual city or town's levy is calculated each year. So we're going to look at a primary residence, a homeowner owner-occupied residence. So that's going to be Class 3 property with a 10% assessment valuation. So the full cash value determined by the assessor for this property is $251,200. Now again, that's typically going to be about 80% of the property value. I can tell you that that's the market value. I can tell you that that's a little bit low because I paid a lot more than that when I bought this house. So my full cash value will be going up next year. Can't hardly wait. Limited property value is set at this house at $215,585. And again, that can go up by no more than how much? 5% a year. There you go. Okay. So the limited property value is sort of stuck, as you can see, a bit lower than full cash. Full cash value, I'm confident in the next year or two is going to go considerably higher. And the limited property value will take several years to catch up to that. Since it's Class 3 property, we're looking at an assessed valuation of 10%. So take your limited property value times 10%, and you get your net assessed value of $21,559. So $21,559 is my assessed valuation on this house, this one piece of property. I'll take my tax rate for the city of Phoenix, in case you're wondering, of 1.3359. That's the primary property tax rate in Phoenix. Phoenix also has a secondary property tax. We're not going to worry about that right now. So you take your tax rate, which is what was set by the mayor and council, times each $100 worth of assessed valuation, and you end up with a tax levy of $215.59 times 1.3359, or a tax bill for the city of Phoenix primary property tax for that year of $288.01. That is the levy on that piece of property. So if you do this same exercise for every piece of property that's in your city or town, you'll find you go to the limited property value, take the particular class that it's in, multiply it by the assessed valuation percentage, you'll get NAV, and then by going through your tax rate against the NAV, you'll see what your levy is. That is essentially all done for you by the assessor's office, and what that shows is what the assessor's office will show you is what your maximum levy is. What you choose to do is all dependent on what rate you apply to it yourself. So that's where you end up. So any questions on calculating levy? Any questions on the difference between rate and levy? I'm not seeing any questions. That's excellent. I like that. All right then. So once again, here's who's supposed to have been doing this presentation, my beloved boss, Tom Belshey. If you have any questions about anything to do with property tax, please do not hesitate to not call me or email me. Send all your questions and comments to Mr. Belshey. He'll be more than happy to answer. I'm kidding. Of course, you can ask me. You'll just probably get a better answer and a more accurate answer from him if you were to contact him. So with that, if there's nothing else that anybody else needs from me, I believe we've reached the end. Thank you all very much for attending. You may now remove the Post-it that was covering my face this whole time and go back about your day. Thank you very much.